If you've ever felt yourself shrinking in a relationship without realizing when it started, this might touch something deep. Many men walk into a narcissistic dynamic believing they're being patient, flexible, or understanding, when the unconscious truth underneath is simpler and far more painful. They've mistaken self-abandonment for strength. This is one of the first illusions I want to name, right here at the start, because it's usually invisible until someone says it out loud. Imagine two shelters in the same storm. One is a fortress carved into bedrock, heavy stones locked into place. The other is a thin tent pitched in a rush, its poles shifting whenever the wind changes direction. On a sunny day, they look similar enough. Both appear upright, both offer shade, both seem functional. The difference only reveals itself when the storm arrives, when pressure tests the integrity of whatever was built long before the clouds gathered. A man's internal authority works the same way. When he knows who he is, when his values are rooted, when his boundaries are not just spoken but inhabited, he becomes the fortress. When he relies on approval, harmony, or someone else's mood to feel stable, he becomes the tent. And a narcissist recognizes the difference almost immediately. Many men don't realize how much of their behavior in these dynamics is shaped by early wounds that were never named. A father whose approval felt like a moving target often teaches a boy that love is something you earn by adapting. A mother whose affection depended on being easy or calm teaches the same boy that conflict is dangerous, that needs are inconvenient, and that his emotions should be negotiated away before anyone else is bothered by them. These imprints don't disappear with age. They simply learn to put on adult clothing. They show up in the way a man swallows discomfort to keep the peace, or softens his no into something someone else will accept, or convinces himself that being the reasonable one is the noble path. What he's actually doing is negotiating pieces of himself without noticing the cost. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the shadow begins to leak into daily life. Not the dramatic, cinematic version of the shadow, but the quieter form, the part of you that knows you're bending too much, yet can't imagine doing anything else. The narcissist in this story easily steps into the trickster role, testing edges not out of curiosity but out of instinct. They press, they probe, they escalate not because they're powerful, but because they're searching for where your center actually lives. And if you haven't found it yourself, they will map that territory faster than you think. Every narcissistic dynamic has a moment, rarely named, but always present, when the man begins to fade without realizing it. It doesn't happen in a dramatic confrontation. It happens in the small silences where he tells himself, "It's not worth bringing up." It happens in the reasonable tone he uses even while feeling insulted. It happens when he apologizes just to end an argument, even though he's not the one who crossed the line. These moments accumulate. One day, he notices something unsettling. He isn't quite sure where he ends, and the relationship begins. This is the psychological erosion that takes place long before a breakup, long before a crisis, long before he calls anything abuse. It starts when he forgets that he ever had non-negotiables at all. When a man delays forming non-negotiables, the narcissist doesn't relax. They calibrate. They observe how far they can push before his voice tightens. They adjust their tactics based on which topics make him deflate. They escalate when he absorbs disrespect instead of naming it. Slowly, the relationship stops being two people relating and becomes one person shaping, extracting, and rewriting the other. That erosion is rarely loud. It's more like watching your own reflection blur a little more every month. There's a point in these dynamics when the fear of losing yourself becomes stronger than the fear of losing the relationship. For many men, that realization arrives late, sometimes after years of being slowly edited into someone they barely recognize. The emotional tension here isn't theatrical, it's quiet, physical, a tightness in the chest, a growing confusion, a sense that you're performing a version of yourself that someone else prefers. The psychological storm has already started, and the tent is beginning to fold. And yet, beneath all of this, there remains one thing a narcissist cannot take. Not through charm, pressure, withdrawal, or rage. They can distort your perception, but they cannot own the part of you that decides who you are. Your alignment with yourself is the one currency that remains untouchable. When a man remembers it, everything changes. Not instantly, and not magically, but meaningfully. If you stay for the midpoint of this video, I'll name the pattern almost every man misses, the exact moment when a narcissist begins to read his presence differently. But before we get there, we have to understand why negotiating your non-negotiables is not generosity. It's fuel, and it feeds the very dynamic you're trying to escape. There is a quiet belief many men carry without knowing they're carrying it. A belief that feels mature, generous, even noble on the surface, but underneath it becomes the very reason they stay stuck in relationships that drain them. The belief sounds like this: if I'm flexible, I'll be loved. If I'm understanding, they'll eventually see my worth. If I bend a little more, maybe this time it won't break. This belief doesn't come from adulthood. It usually comes from early conditioning, especially when affection in childhood was tied to performance. A mother who loved most when the boy was easy, calm, or helpful doesn't need to say the words. The child's nervous system absorbs the rule. Love arrives when you cost nothing. Years later, this man meets someone with narcissistic traits and misreads the dynamic completely. He thinks his flexibility is kindness. The narcissist reads it as availability, malleability, open territory. There is a moment early in these relationships that often goes unnoticed. A moment when the man gives the narcissist their first real piece of information about him. It might happen when he quickly says, "It's fine," even though his body tightens. Or when he dismisses a small disrespect to avoid conflict. Or when he offers an apology he doesn't believe in just to bring the moment back to peace. None of these seem dramatic. But to someone who relies on control to regulate their identity, these moments are data points, not gestures. This is where Jung's idea of the inflated persona becomes practical. The persona is the mask we develop to function in the world. In a narcissist, the mask often becomes exaggerated, covering a fragile core with a grand or superior facade. But something else happens on the other side of the dynamic as well. When a man is excessively flexible, when he constantly adjusts himself to fit someone else's comfort, his persona inflates too. Not in a grandiose direction, but in a self-erasing one. A kind of over-accommodation that signals without words that his outer behavior and inner truth are out of sync. To a narcissist, this split is unmistakable. They don't interpret your flexibility as compassion. They interpret it as fragmentation, something to shape, something without a center, something that will bend further if pressure is applied. This is one of the destabilizing realizations men often confront. The trait they were most proud of, being easygoing, patient, understanding, is the very trait being used against them. There is also a counterintuitive truth here, one that many men only discover after the relationship has already taken a toll. The narcissist does not respect kindness. They respect friction. Not aggression, not volume, not dominance, but the subtle resistance that comes from someone who cannot be emotionally moved by weather systems that are not their own. When your identity does not shift every time the narcissist shifts theirs, something recalibrates in the dynamic. Until then, every act of flexibility is misread as a signal that you have no internal anchor. It's often in the smallest interactions that this pattern reveals itself. A man says, "Don't worry about it," and he thinks the moment has passed. The narcissist pauses, even if only for a fraction of a second. That pause is not relief. It is assessment. It is recognition that the line they just crossed was not protected. It is the moment where they calculate how much more pressure the dynamic will tolerate. Many men, looking back months or years later, describe these subtle pauses as the pivot points where the relationship quietly shifted into something harsher. They didn't notice it then. They only notice it in retrospect, when the cost has already accumulated. There is a sentence here that some men find difficult to hear, but it often opens something essential. Every time you negotiate a non-negotiable, you are teaching someone how to treat you. Not because you lack strength, but because you were never shown that strength could look like stillness instead of sacrifice. When this lands, the dynamic begins to make more sense. Flexibility is not the problem, it's the meaning assigned to it. In a healthy connection, flexibility is mutual. In a narcissistic one, it becomes a map of where control can expand without resistance. And the narcissist follows that map with precision. This brings us to the next question, the one that naturally arises when a man realizes his kindness has been misread. If flexibility is interpreted as weakness, then what does the narcissist actually respond to? The answer becomes clearer the moment the dynamic shifts from emotional reaction to emotional clarity, and control becomes the unspoken battlefield. That is where we go in the next chapter. If you stay with this, 2 sections ahead, we'll look at a real turning point a survivor described after finally recognizing this pattern. There is a quiet pattern that forms in nearly every narcissistic dynamic, and most men only see it in hindsight. The narcissist begins learning you, not through conversation, but through your reactions. Your reactivity becomes a kind of emotional GPS they use to navigate and control the relationship. They don't need full arguments or dramatic moments. They study the subtle cues, the tightening in your jaw, the way your voice rises a little when you feel misunderstood, the rush to explain yourself when a false accusation is thrown at you, the softening of your tone when they pull away. Each reaction becomes a breadcrumb that leads them deeper into your insecurities. When a man is trauma-bonded or stretched thin by chronic emotional unpredictability, his nervous system almost always goes into a hypervigilant state. This isn't a flaw. It's the body trying to keep him safe. The amygdala, the part of the brain wired for threat detection, begins firing faster than the rest of him can catch up. In this state, his reactions become almost automatic. He defends himself reflexively. He explains too much. He tries to repair the moment before it has even fully happened. The narcissist does not always do this consciously, but they respond to this nervous system exposure instinctively. If they can evoke a reaction, they can regain control. If they can predict your emotional pattern, they can stay in the position of power. There is something disorienting and strangely empowering about realizing that your reactivity has been guiding the entire choreography. Many men believe the narcissist's behavior is random or chaotic, but there is a deeper structure to it. Every emotional spike, every defensive explanation, every attempt to appease gives the narcissist more information about where your psychological openings are. It doesn't mean you are weak. It means the relationship has trained your system to try to prevent conflict instead of evaluate it. The shift begins the moment you interrupt this choreography, not with a performance, not with coldness, and not with passive-aggressive withdrawal, but with something far quieter, a pause, a regulated, grounded pause, 3 seconds of breath, a slower blink, a softer tone not born from fear, but from clarity. When a man stops reacting in the patterned way, something unexpected happens. The narcissist's strategy glitches. This is where the nervous system becomes a practical tool rather than a theory. A regulated pause moves you out of amygdala-driven reactivity and back into the part of the brain capable of making choices. It allows you to answer the moment rather than survive it. And for the narcissist, this change is profoundly destabilizing. They're accustomed to reading you like a predictable script. Emotional neutrality disrupts the script entirely. Neutrality in this sense is not indifference. It is not emotional absence. It is the refusal to perform the role they've written for you. Instead of escalating, you become still. Instead of defending, you become grounded. Instead of chasing clarity from someone invested in confusion, you step out of the dynamic long enough to see it. The narcissist doesn't interpret this neutrality as passivity. They interpret it as loss of access. They feel the shift immediately, often before you do. They sense the difference between a man who is overwhelmed and a man who is anchored. For someone who depends on psychological penetration to maintain control, a closed emotional door is far more threatening than raised voices. Raised voices still offer engagement. Neutral presence does not. A helpful image comes from Kurosawa's samurai films. The moments of greatest power are rarely the sword strikes or the dramatic clashes. The real tension is in the stillness before action, the moment the master stands in complete calm while the world around him thrashes. The calm does not signal surrender. It signals that the center of gravity has moved inward, that the warrior's power no longer leaks into the environment. Narcissists recognize that same stillness. They may not name it, but they feel the shift in the atmosphere. Something is no longer available to them. This is where one of the deeper reframes emerges. Many men believe that controlling their reactivity will earn respect. In truth, neutrality alone doesn't create respect. It simply interrupts the pattern. Respect forms only when the neutrality is paired with something deeper, a boundary that is not dependent on their approval, their mood, or their interpretation. Until that boundary becomes tangible, the narcissist simply tries new ways to provoke, test, or pull you back into the old choreography, which leads us into the next chapter. Once reactivity no longer fuels the dynamic, the question becomes, what truly stops the narcissist from overriding your limits? The answer is a non-negotiable they cannot bypass, a boundary with a cost attached, not a request or an ideal. That is where we go next. There is a quiet fear many men carry in relationships, and very few will say it out loud. If I enforce a boundary, I'll lose the connection. It is a fear that often traces back to early relational wounds, not dramatic ones, but subtle patterns. Moments when expressing a need led to distance, when telling the truth led to withdrawal, when showing discomfort made affection feel conditional. Over time, a boy learns to equate boundaries with abandonment. As an adult, he still feels the same tremor. He may speak firmly, but inside he's bracing for loss. In a narcissistic dynamic, this fear becomes visible almost immediately. The narcissist does not respond to your words. They respond to the emotional frequency underneath them. They notice the hesitation in your voice, the uncertainty after you set your limit, the way your eyes search their expression to see if you're still safe. It isn't cruelty that guides them. It's instinct. They test boundaries not because they are powerful, but because they can sense you won't hold the line when the cost feels too high. This is one of the moments in the dynamic where the man often feels most confused. He believes he has set a boundary. He explained it clearly. He repeated it calmly. He named what feels respectful to him. But the narcissist behaves as though nothing was said. They escalate. They push, they dismiss, they rationalize, and the man begins to doubt himself. The deeper truth is that a boundary without consequence is not a boundary. It is a preference. It is a wish. It is a structural opening that the narcissist intuitively understands. Machiavelli wrote about power not as domination, but as something quietly recognized. He suggested that influence comes not from declarations, but from what others believe you are willing to protect. A boundary functions on the same principle. It lives not in the sentence spoken, but in the consistency of what happens when the line is crossed. Without that second piece, the narcissist does not recalibrate. They adapt their strategy. Many men discover this in a pattern that repeats. They say, I don't accept being yelled at, but continue the conversation when the yelling begins. They say, I need respect in disagreements, but end up apologizing just to end the tension. They say, this behavior hurts me, but tolerate it when it returns. To the narcissist, the spoken limit becomes irrelevant. The consistent behavior becomes the true rule of the relationship. Here is the sentence that often lands with weight. The narcissist doesn't test your boundary because they're strong. They test it because they can feel your fear of enforcing it. This is not an indictment. It is an invitation to understand the mechanics beneath the surface. The narcissist is not looking for your words. They are looking for whether your identity rests on the relationship staying intact. If it does, the dynamic bends. This is where a simple, grounded form of boundary emerges, one with a natural consequence attached, not as punishment, but as a shift in participation. Something as straightforward as, if you raise your voice, I pause the conversation and leave the room. The strength here is not in the sentence, but in the follow-through. No emotional charge, no negotiation, no performance. Just a quiet removal of your presence when the dynamic becomes unsafe for your integrity. It is physics rather than confrontation. The first time this happens, the narcissist often pushes harder. Not because the boundary is wrong, but because they are accustomed to your internal fear overriding your external clarity. But when the action stays consistent, the narcissist receives a new piece of information. This man's participation cannot be extracted through pressure. His identity is stabilizing. And here lies the reframing moment that many men don't expect. A boundary with a consequence does not make the narcissist behave better out of sudden enlightenment. It makes them recalculate. They feel, perhaps for the first time, that your internal structure is no longer negotiable. They may not like it, but they recognize it. In their world, recognition often precedes respect. Still, even this type of boundary can collapse if something deeper hasn't shifted. If you hold the line externally but internally still fear standing alone, the boundary becomes a performance rather than an embodiment. The narcissist senses this split instantly, which brings us to the heart of the dynamic. Respect is not earned by a boundary itself, but by the identity behind it. And the moment that identity shifts, everything else follows. In the next chapter, we reach the midpoint reversal, the psychological moment when the narcissist begins to see you differently because you are no longer participating in the story they have written for you. There comes a moment in almost every narcissistic dynamic when a man realizes he has been fighting for something that never truly existed. Not the connection itself, but the hope that if he could just show enough patience, enough loyalty, enough emotional endurance, the relationship would finally stabilize. Beneath that hope lives an old wound, the belief that love is earned through effort rather than received through mutual respect. This belief turns the narcissist's chaos into an arena, a place where the man unconsciously tries to prove his worth, not to the narcissist, but to the unseen figures from his past. This is where the wounded hero archetype comes alive, not the grand mythic warrior, but the boy who learned to chase approval by solving problems that were never his to solve. He becomes the peacemaker, the fixer, the interpreter of mood swings. He believes that if he can finally get it right, the conflict will stop and the love will stay. It's an old script, rewritten in adult language. The narcissist doesn't create this script, they simply step into it. Self-determination theory offers a simple frame for what happens next. Human well-being depends on three psychological pillars: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. In a narcissistic relationship, all three collapse slowly. Autonomy fades as the man begins adjusting every decision to avoid conflict. Competence erodes because his best efforts never seem to make things better. Relatedness becomes distorted into cycles of tension and brief relief, which he misreads as connection. Over time, he confuses survival with bonding. He begins to believe that navigating volatility is the same as being loved. But something profound shifts when he stops performing inside the emotional theater the narcissist has constructed. This shift rarely begins with a dramatic moment. It begins with an internal recalibration, a quiet understanding that he cannot keep trading self-respect for temporary peace. And from that understanding, he begins stepping out of the script. In practical terms, stepping out does not look like defiance. It looks like clarity. When the narcissist accuses him unfairly, he no longer rushes into long explanations. When they distort the narrative, he no longer tries to convince them of his intentions. He stops auditioning for their approval. Instead of defending himself, he names reality without urgency. Instead of absorbing every emotional spike, he lets silence do the work. There is something disarmingly powerful about a man who stops proving himself. In one clinical conversation, a man described the moment this shift occurred for him. After years of defending his character against accusations that changed depending on the mood of the day, something in him settled. His former patterns rose up, the impulse to explain, the need to clarify, the fear of being misunderstood, but instead of following them, he allowed them to pass. He simply said, in a tone steady enough to surprise even himself, that he would respond when respect was present. Then he stepped away from the conversation. What startled him was not her reaction, but his own internal state. There was no adrenaline spike, no frantic self-doubt, no collapse into guilt, just clarity. The narcissistic partner, who was used to immediate emotional engagement, shifted tone instantly. She recalibrated, not because she suddenly became healthier, but because the script had lost its lead actor. Here lies one of the deep turning points of these dynamics. The narcissist cannot manipulate a role you refuse to play, and this refusal is not an act of rebellion. It is an identity shift. The moment you no longer define yourself through their reactions, something in the relational structure breaks open. The narcissist senses that their usual methods, provoking, confusing, destabilizing, no longer land in the same way. They may escalate, they may withdraw, or they may attempt charm, but all of those responses point to the same realization. They no longer have the same access to your emotional core. This is where a gentle yet powerful question begins to form, almost by itself. If I no longer participate in the story they're writing about me, then who am I allowed to become? It is a question that opens space inside the psyche, making room for a new kind of stability. But this shift alone is not enough. Clarity must be lived, not performed. A man can step out of the script for a moment and still return to old patterns if he hasn't anchored himself in something deeper. And this is the pivot we move toward next, the moment when a man chooses principle over attachment, and the dynamic changes in a way that cannot be undone. Stay with this, because the next chapter explores the shift survivors often describe as the irreversible turning point. There is a point in these dynamics when a man stops negotiating with the storm around him and begins listening to the quiet truth within him. It rarely announces itself with clarity. More often, it arrives through exhaustion, an exhaustion so deep it feels cellular. He notices that no matter how much he tries to stabilize the relationship, he is the only one holding the emotional weight. He notices that peace only appears when he abandons himself. He notices that every attempt to keep the connection intact costs him a piece of his coherence. And eventually, something in him whispers a line he has been avoiding for years. I cannot keep losing myself to keep someone else. Attachment trauma complicates this moment. A man who grew up equating connection with safety will instinctively choose the relationship, even when the relationship is harming him. The fear of standing alone can feel sharper than the pain of staying. In the nervous system, this is not a moral weakness. It is survival memory. The body would rather cling to a familiar chaos than face the vastness of solitude. Narcissists sense this instinct immediately. They feel the exact point where attachment overrides self-respect. They recognize the tremor beneath the boundary, the softening after a firm statement, the way the man's voice tilts toward reconciliation, even while he's describing his hurt. This is why the choice that shifts everything is not behavioral. It is existential. It is the moment a man decides, quietly and without spectacle, that he would rather lose the relationship than lose his integrity. Nietzsche's phrase, "becoming who you are," takes on a relational meaning here, not a slogan, not a self-help mantra, a law. When a man chooses truth over belonging, he becomes someone the narcissist cannot govern, not because he becomes defiant, but because his allegiance shifts inward. His psychological center of gravity is no longer located in the relationship. It is located in his principles. This is one of the destabilizing reframes that tends to land with weight. Respect does not appear when you enforce rules. It appears when you refuse to trade your selfhood for emotional access. Rules can be twisted, contested, negotiated. But identity, when lived, not performed, is immovable. A man who knows what he will not betray is not someone a narcissist can easily manipulate, not because he is cold or distant, but because he is whole. There are subtle signals that this shift has taken root. The narcissist's tone changes, not because they have transformed, but because the relationship's governing physics have changed. They may stop attacking and begin negotiating. They may ask questions instead of making accusations. They may become oddly cautious with their words. This is not reconciliation. It is recognition. They have registered that the man standing in front of them is no longer the same man they molded. His emotional skin has thickened. His boundaries feel real. His presence has weight. What many men find surprising is that this internal shift does not always require dramatic action. Sometimes it looks like a single breath before responding. Sometimes it looks like refusing to participate in a circular argument. Sometimes it looks like silence in the face of provocation. At first, these gestures feel small, but over time, they accumulate into a new posture, one that signals, without aggression, that the man's identity has become a fixed point in the room. A useful experiment, offered gently rather than as instruction, can help anchor this shift. If you want an internal reference point, you might place a hand on your chest during a difficult conversation and notice the sensations underneath. Not to calm yourself, but to hear yourself. Then, ask a simple question. If I valued my future self as much as I fear losing this person, what choice would I make here? The answer rarely shouts. It usually emerges as a quiet sense of alignment, a subtle softening or tightening in the body, a recognition of what keeps you coherent. As this alignment strengthens, something irreversible begins to happen. The narcissist can no longer treat your identity as an editable document. You become someone they must reckon with, rather than someone they can shape. Not through confrontation, but through presence. Not through dominance, but through groundedness. You are no longer participating in the emotional economy they depend on. This brings us to the final synthesis. The journey does not end with the boundary, or the pause, or even the identity shift. It ends with something deeper, the one non-negotiable that cannot be manipulated, because it is not a rule, but a way of being. That is where we go in the conclusion. Imagine a large tree standing in an open field. Storm after storm moves across the landscape. The branches bend, the bark cracks, leaves are torn away. To anyone watching from a distance, it might look fragile or overwhelmed. But beneath the soil, something entirely different is happening. With every gust of wind, the roots adapt. They lengthen, they deepen, they weave themselves further into the earth that holds them. The tree is not surviving the storm by being rigid, it is surviving by being rooted. A man who has lived through narcissistic dynamics often feels like that tree during the worst parts of the storm. His identity has been pushed, questioned, twisted, softened. He has bent himself to preserve peace, bent himself to avoid abandonment, bent himself to be understood. But there comes a moment when bending becomes impossible, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. The roots begin to matter more than the branches. The man begins to notice that every time he betrays himself, something essential loosens within him. And every time he honors his inner truth, something quietly strengthens. This is where the deepest shift takes place. The non-negotiable that cannot be manipulated is not a rule, not a boundary, not a tactic, and not a stance. It is alignment with yourself. Alignment is not rigid. It doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't require constant clarity. It simply means that the distance between what you know and what you live becomes smaller. When a man begins living in that distance, closing the gap between his internal truth and his external behavior, he becomes someone a narcissist cannot distort, because there is no longer an opening to enter. Throughout this journey, it is easy to believe that respect from a narcissist comes from strategy, from silence, from boundaries, from composure, from predictable calm. But the truth is quieter and more enduring. Respect is a side effect, not a goal. It emerges when your inner order becomes more stable than the emotional storms around you. A narcissist recalibrates, not because you've mastered a technique, but because your identity stops being a negotiating table. You are no longer shaped by their moods, their distortions, or their approval. What this means is that the fortress we spoke about at the beginning was never something you had to learn to build. It was something you had to remember. Your dignity, your clarity, your boundaries, your self-respect. None of these are inventions. They are returns. They are recoveries of what was covered, not what was missing. When you operate from this rootedness, the dynamics around you shift because you are no longer available for the roles you once played. The beauty of alignment is that it doesn't require confrontation. It requires coherence. You do not need to force anyone to respect you. You do not need to argue your worth. You do not need to prove your intentions. You simply become someone whose sense of self is not sourced from the outside. And paradoxically, that is the moment when the narcissist, if they stay in your life, begins treating you differently. Not out of love, but out of recognition. You have become harder to move. There is often a quiet grief at this stage. The man realizes how long he has lived disconnected from himself. He recognizes the ways he has softened his voice, minimized his needs, and tolerated what should never have been tolerated. But alongside the grief, something else appears. A calm that does not depend on the behavior of others. A sense of internal order that feels like steady ground after years of emotional vertigo. This is the place where the journey ends, not in triumph, not in dramatic liberation, but in remembrance. The remembrance that your life is built from the inside out. That alignment will cost you certain relationships, but it will return you to yourself. That storms will continue to come, but your roots can deepen with each one. If this conversation mapped something in your experience, one line can be enough to crystallize it. Perhaps there was a moment you recognized, a shift you felt in your body, or a silence that revealed something true. Naming even a single signal helps others see their own turning points more clearly.